They will all. So while we wait for others to join, because I know a couple of more people at least have confirmed, and we could have a quick presentation or ask everyone perhaps on the chat, because as we're running this in a webinar series, to maybe write what are your expectations on the sessions, and any top questions you may want to have answered here, having read the bit of the summary and the PDF that might help us already, that some of our panelists might take that into account. And I'll certainly start taking notes of the question for the moderation session. Okay, it's 1:05. We still have more people coming in, but I think perhaps we can start, and then as people join, they can follow. So good morning, good afternoon. Wherever you are, we have a very interesting range of time zones here, from perhaps West Asia all the way to the western coast of the American continent. Thank you all for joining this conversation that we wanted to have on large-scale conservation targets. My name is Imen Millienne. I am the Regional Vice Chair of the World Commission on Protected Areas for North Africa, Middle East, and West Asia, and it is my pleasure to be the moderator today. So today we wanted to talk about large-scale conservation targets, as was said in the invitation, and this discussion was largely motivated by Motion 101, which is set an area-based conservation target based on evidence of what nature and people need to thrive. Which is currently presented at the IUCN World Conservation Congress that will take place in about 10 days in Marseille. So those of you who don't know IUCN, it is the International Union of Conservation of Nature, and it held this Congress and its members' assembly every 4 years. And motions are an instrument to set IUCN's policy. In particularly, the way they are voted is that both governments and NGOs vote on motion, which is a very interesting space to discuss conservation needs and priority, and to set them for the few years to come. So Motion 101 originally called for protecting half of nature, and this motion has generated a very interesting debate during the online discussion that had happened at the end of 2020. And I'm sure it will generate an equally interesting and passionate debate in a few days in Marseille. As you know, in recent years, large-scale conservation targets have been increasingly called for as a solution to address both the biodiversity crisis and stabilizing the climate emergency. We started calling with a 10% protection target back in 2000. In 2010, that was increased to 17% of terrestrial and 10% for marine by 2020. And the current draft of the 2030 target calls for 30%, which is already a stretch for some governments. But the discussion on these targets is set to preoccupy the global conservation policy agenda for the years to come. Not all spatial targets are made the same, and there's a bit of confusion, I have to confess, having been in some of these discussions. And I think on one hand, we have an unequivocal scientific evidence that the biodiversity loss and the climate change crisis are at an unprecedented level. We also have scientific evidence that protected areas work and that conservation targets work. And sometimes when we go into this debate, it becomes a political discussion. Some ask what's the scientific rationale for calling for any numbers, but often the debate goes into balancing ambition and realistic implementation. So today with the panel that we have, Vance Martin, who's the president of Wild Foundation and the chair of the Wilderness Specialist Group within the World Commission on Protected Areas. He also sits on the Nature Needs Half Steering Committee. We also have Amy Lewis, who's the vice president for policy and communication of the Wild Foundation, and Dr. Javi Locke, who's the chair of Beyond the Ice Sheet Targets Task Force within WCPA, and also chairs the Nature Needs Half Steering Committee. We wanted to hear more about the science and also have a very frank discussion on these targets, the usefulness of these targets, how they can be used, how they can be implemented, and what should we call for. So without further ado, let's start this, and I'll pass the floor on to Vance. Vance, take it on.
Thank you, Imen. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. 2005, we convened the 8th World Wilderness Congress in Alaska. And the Wild Foundation is the steward of this Congress, but it's a large coalition of governments, NGOs, indigenous communities. And at that Congress, we had some 1,800 delegates from 60 countries. And one of the sessions that the Wild Foundation supported and helped to start was the Tribal Lands and Wilderness Congress. It was one of many technical and cultural subsessions of that Congress. Well, in that Tribal Lands and Wilderness Council, Grand Chief Herb Norwegian of the Dene Decho in Canada called for all Indigenous communities around the world to protect at least half their land in order to be in accord with their traditional knowledge, their traditional science. It was interesting to us because this began to dovetail with much of the science that was being done in the boreal north, as well as in the Amazon, looking at critical minimum size, as the science says, of intact ecosystems in order to continue to produce the ecological services, essentially life support. So it was an interesting convergence starting about 15, 16 years ago. We worked with that and with various other groups. And when we convened the 9th World Wilderness Congress in Mexico, opened by the president of Mexico, Felipe Calderon, again, about the same number of people, 1,500 from 60 or 65 countries, we closed that Congress with an official call to our delegates, as well as the world conservation community, to accept the science and traditional knowledge that all converge to say that we need to protect, give or take, half of critical ecosystems on land and sea if we want to support life on Earth. It's a very simple proposition. In my mind, and I leave you with this thought before my colleagues present their views. we're talking about science, absolutely. And we know that the world also runs on politics, but there's no harm, in fact, only good, if major institutions recognize the science and the traditional knowledge. And then politics works what it has to, but if the conservation community does not stand up for the science and the traditional knowledge, then who will? So that's our position. I'll close by saying, I also feel that beyond science, we're talking about a new relationship. And relationship is something that everybody understands. We can argue science until the day is over. But we all know what it takes to create a successful relationship. The most fundamental relationship we have is between human society and nature. We need nature ultimately. So we're in a relationship. We don't want a dysfunctional or failed relationship. And so with the science and the sense of respect and relationship, we're moving ahead, and we have done for all these years, and we continue with what we call Nature Needs Half. And I ask my colleagues now to provide their perspective. Thank you, Amin. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Vance. That's very interesting to hear a little bit about the history of this, but also, as you said, this relationship with nature. And I think it is, in the past year alone, all the new reports that we have seen, the latest being the latest IPCC report, puts that urgency even more up front. So thanks for that. Amy, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Amin. I am so honored to be here among the many distinguished guests and panelists. And I will be presenting on specifically what Motion 101 is and why it's so urgently needed, before turning over the floor to Dr. Harvey Locke, who will explain a little bit more about how we can accomplish this in a pragmatic way. So I'm going to share my screen right now. Here we go. So Motion 101 began, and we are continuing to urge it in this fashion as a motion to protect half the planet and to recognize the science behind the protection of half the planet. This motion now has an amendment, a proposed amendment to it for 30%. And just to be clear, we are moving forward with promoting half. And Harvey might speak a little bit more to that. The challenge here is that I think every country is feeling this at the moment. We need to solve for climate change while effectively addressing other economic and social problems. Unfortunately, our ecological problems are not happening in a vacuum. One could make the argument that many of our economic and social and ecological problems are rooted in the same source. But we still have to balance agendas to provide for the needs of society while also providing for the needs of the nature and ecology that support us. As we all know, jobs and livelihoods often dominate political agendas, as well as economic development policies that oftentimes can promote unhealthy conditions or at least the deterioration of nature, but at the same time appease the economic interests of the state, which provide are an important source of revenue. And no one can be blamed if there are moments when they feel like there's no easy way to balance climate change policies, conservation policies, and economic development policies. But what I am here and what my distinguished panelists are here to share with you is that we very much believe that protecting wild nature is a bridge between sound economic policies and climate policies, and that by ensuring protections now and ensuring that there's enough healthy, abundant ecology now, we're actually going to make it easier than it would be otherwise to solve our economic and climate problems in the future. The great thing about wild nature is it's a pre-existing, globally available resource that we can effectively reimagine to address many of our problems. I think right now, wild nature is often perceived as empty land that doesn't really do anything because it's not producing economic revenue. But as we all know, wild nature actually is doing quite a few things. It's sequestering carbon. It's also drawing down carbon, especially when we restore wild areas. It's providing for disease prevention, healthy soils, stable weather patterns. And we don't have to deploy this. We don't have to scale it up. It's there already. All we have to do is leave it alone and protect it. By utilizing this resource in this way, we're going to save money in our attempts to address climate change, as well as gaining support of the multiple stakeholders who depend on intact wild nature right now, like Indigenous and traditional communities. This September, we all have an opportunity to take a big step towards setting a new course and new relationship with wild nature, and voting yes on motion 101 for half, which is what the scientific recommendation is, and making this the official recommendation of the IUCN to the Convention on Biological Diversity. This is the biggest opportunity that wild nature has this year in our policy agenda, especially with the changes happening to the Convention on Biological Diversity. And it's a step we need to take globally as a planet to begin to move forward to a truly healthy and sustainable relationship. So why would you consider endorsing for this motion or voting for it? Well, first off, wild nature is our best ally, as Vance has said, in the climate emergency. If by protecting wild nature, we are not only continuing to sequester the hundreds of parts per million of carbon that are in the soil, but we're also able to draw down and prevent new releases of carbon. When wild nature is destroyed, carbon's released into the atmosphere, and this just exacerbates climate change. It's the scientific consensus. Harvey will probably mention a little bit more about this, but a survey of scientists globally has shown that 70% of them support protecting at least half of Earth's land and seas. And there's reasons for that. There's a lot of research behind this. And in the chat, I'm going to post a link to this presentation. At the end of the presentation, you'll see a number of resources that you can look to find those references and to find those studies that show this is the scientific consensus. Protecting and restoring nature is good for the economy. Just last year, the World Economic Forum published a report that said that 400 million jobs can be created in the next 10 years if we shift to a restorative economy and begin restoring nature versus destroying it. Protecting half of nature is also good for people. And there's another part of this slide that I haven't put on the slide, but it's important to recognize too. First, 1.6 billion people around the world depend directly on wild nature for their subsistence and their livelihoods. In addition, the rest of us depend on wild nature for the ecological services that we benefit from on a daily basis. But also, new surveys that you can read about in National Geographic and elsewhere are showing that more and more people around the world actually support protecting half. 12 countries were surveyed recently, and a majority of those surveyed said they support protecting half the planet. So this is not only becoming the scientific consensus, more and more people around the world, more and more constituencies support it. What we're advancing with Motion 101 is 50% globally, not necessarily regionally or within certain states. There are vital landscapes that must be protected, some of them far over 50%, rainforests, for example. We recognize that not all areas can achieve 50%, and not all areas need to protect 50%. So just keep in mind, this is a motion with global implications, not national. By protecting Earth's land and seas, we secure this cornerstone of sustainability for the future. And I guarantee you, if we don't do this now, we will be coming back again and again to the IUCN and other global institutions until we do. This isn't going to go away. Just a brief slide on protecting half and 30%. We are actually working very closely with the Campaign for Nature and the 30% target. And the way we in the Nature Needs Half Steering Committee view this is much the same way that the 2017 Paris Climate COP played out. And that was, there were two targets there. There was keeping temperature rise under 1.5 degrees, which is the scientific backed target, and keeping temperature rise under 2 degrees, which is the politically feasible target. Paris recognized both. The world committed to 2 degrees, but they also formally recognized 1.5 degrees, that was the science. And that's what we're asking for right now. We want formal recognition for what the scientists and the traditional scientists already know. Briefly, Motion 101 recognizes Indigenous leadership. We are working, not only are we working with several Indigenous groups, but as Vance said, this idea has its roots in Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous leadership. And so there shouldn't be any confusion about our commitment to free and prior and informed consent around Indigenous lands, or our support for Indigenous wisdom in this movement. Who supports Motion 101? There's Avaz, there's several Indigenous groups, IPAC, the Sierra Club, one of the North America's largest conservation organizations, and many, many more. On the Nature Needs Half website, we have dozens, close to 70 members and endorsers of the Nature Needs Half movement. And I'll share these links after my presentation. Finally, this is the resource page. I'm also going to provide you a web page on Motion 101 where you can find more resources and go through this at a slower pace. I know I've sped through this presentation, but that's only because I'm really excited to hear what Dr. Locke has to say, and I think that you will be too. So your vote this September will help decide humanity's future. We're asking that you think very hard and consider voting for half and for Motion 101. I want to thank you all for your attention and for joining us. And I want to hand this back over to Amen and Dr. Locke.
Thank you, Amy. That was very interesting. And thank you also for touching on two important points. One is that the target is global. And it is not national, because this is one of the misconceptions when we are in the negotiation of global targets as to how they going to be handled. And the second point is that the clarity about the science, because it's important to recognize what the science says and what we need, and then the political discussion can go in whatever the political agreement would be. So just a reminder to the participants that please send your questions via the chat. I mean, I've been discussing with Harvey on several meetings in WCPA, and you know, coming from a region where it's very difficult to implement a 50% at a national level, and coming from the Mediterranean region where we have, you know, modified landscapes. We don't have the big wilderness as in other regions of the world. We always talk about how can you do it, but how can you do it? And I trust that's what he's gonna talk to us about in unfolding the three-based approach. So Harvey, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Thank you, ma'am. And yes, indeed, I'm going to do what you were hoping I would do. Can you see my shared screen?
Good. Yes, we can see your screen if you can put it in presentation mode.
Can you see that now?
Perfect.
All right. So thank you, Vance, Amy, and Amen. And thank you, everyone, for the chance to share some thoughts with you. So it's useful to just sort of go from very broad concepts down to the little bit more narrow ones about how we can do things. But first, I think it's helpful to, what is the goal that we're trying to achieve here? And the goal is to, they're basically these high level goals, which is we need to keep the earth functioning. We need to benefit people. We need to keep everything alive. These are pretty simple goals. So the question is, what do we need to do to achieve those simple but important goals? The Convention on Biological Diversity, which is actually in parallel to this webinar, having its meetings right now on the framework. So I was just watching that when I came over to here. There's basically these goals of ensuring that biodiversity is always there, that we maintain the ecosystem services that come from nature, that we sustain a healthy planet and the integrity of the Earth ecosystem, and we deliver benefits to people. So that's what we're trying to achieve. And they're basically the only three things we need to do at the highest level. Whoops, did I freeze? Okay. We need to protect nature, we need to shift to more sustainable production methods, and we need to shift to more sustainable consumption methods. That's what we need to do. I'm going to focus, as did Amy Advance, on the protecting nature question. So, as Imen mentioned, I was appointed chair of a task force by the World Commission on Protected Areas to see a scientific consensus on how much conservation we need to do, area-based conservation, protected areas, and other effective conservation measures that are area-based. So I engaged in a multi-year process with all kinds of my colleagues, including everybody on this call. And it was really clear from talking to people all over the world, the largest survey of scientists ever done about what they think, and the largest literature review of scientific literature ever done, all of which is published, by the way, that really the call for protecting about half the world is rock solid in relation to all of the scientific opinion and literature. And there's, in a given area, there's a range somewhere between 30 and 70%. But that if you're looking for the number that's closest to what people think needs to happen, it's at least half. And it's not 50% or 49.2%, it's an order of magnitude, it's at least half. And those resources Amy flagged. But this immediately raises the question, how can you realistically do that? And it doesn't matter whether you take the target 3, which is in the current draft CBD framework of at least 30%, or you take half or 50%. It doesn't matter, you still have to think through what the solution is to doing that. So I began wrestling this with, I'm Canadian, and one of the things we had to wrestle with in Canada is, you know, our country is the second largest in the world, but it's not the same everywhere. We have in the pink areas here, this color here, this is highly populated, highly productive agriculturally. Third largest city in North America is there. And it's a heavily impacted system full of endangered species. This green area is an area that isn't fertile for farming, but that has things like logging and mining and oil and gas in it, plus large protected areas like Banff National Park, where I live in Western Canada. So it's a mix. And then these areas here in the north are among the wildest, most intact places in the world. So how do you think about a conservation target there? It all matters. And it's actually driven by how humans have used the land so far, and the ocean kind of tells us what the art of the possible is in the present. And interestingly, when you look at how intensely humans use landscape, this is a map of my country again, you can see where the species at risk are concentrated. Makes perfect sense. Wherever those cities and farms are, it tends to have the highest number of species at risk. Intermediate areas and intermediate level, and the wildest areas, few or none. Oops. I jumped a slide. So what we came to realize is that there's actually a pattern in the world, that pattern that holds in Canada holds globally. I'm sorry. that there are actually three global conditions. There's cities and farms. There's these, what we call shared lands, that intermediate area. Often will have grazing, but not so much cultivation from a farming point of view. And then there's these really large wild areas. And this pattern holds, if you look at the world as a whole, quite remarkably. Now, this is from a paper I led with scientists from China, Australia, Africa, Europe, North America, and South America. And what you can see is this, there's Canada up here, those three conditions that I was just showing you another way. And if you come over to this part of the world that this webinar is about, you can see you also have those three conditions. So let's zero in on that a little bit. So this is on the website naturebeyond2020.com. is a map of every country in the world by the three conditions. So you can just go on to naturebeyond2020.com and say, find your country map. It also has some regional maps like this one on it. Excuse me. And what we see is along the coasts here, where Amen is sitting, for example, you can see there's cities and farms. Then there's a sort of rural shared lands area. And we all know that this is a very large desert here. And similar things happen over here. Along the coast of the Mediterranean, you know, this is an old, heavily populated area that's been used by humanity for a very long time. We know that sort of the cradles of civilization, as we tend to call them in the West, arose here. This is not raw wilderness country in the heavily settled areas. That's really clear, and that won't change. So let's start with reality. So let's take a couple of countries out of this map. So if we need to protect half the world, which we do, and if we want to figure out how to practically do that at the country level, which we need to do, let's look at a country by country. So there's Morocco. Your strategies, here's cities and farms in Morocco. Here's the sort of shared landscapes around those cities and farms, and here's the wilder areas of Morocco. And a green dot is less than half of basically 100 square kilometer intact area. So these are big areas, or areas that don't have detectable human impacts from remote sensing. If you look at Jordan, it's also got all three conditions. Different things in different places. If you look at Lebanon, it only has two conditions. So it's, and the condition of the shared landscape, the yellow, what that means, the difference between the shared landscape and the cities and farms landscape is, in the cities and farms landscape, over half of it is completely transformed either by cultivation or by human development. The shared landscape is from half transformed to less than half of 1 square kilometer per 100 square kilometers transformed. So the shared landscapes can have a significant degree of wildness in them, but the shared landscape is nowhere near as heavily transformed as the cities and farms. If you look globally at sort of what goes on in those places, you see really different things. For example, in the cities and farms areas, which is 18% of the world, 3/4 of people live there. Most of our food calories are produced there. 72% of our food calories are produced there. Other end of the spectrum, 26.5% of the world may be a large wild area. Less than 0.3% of our food calories are produced there. So there are very different things happening in these places, and our strategies need to recognize that. So from a cities and farms point of view, what we need to do is secure endangered species, protect all the remaining fragments, maintain functions like pollination, do ecological restoration, keep nitrogen out of streams, give people access to nature, regenerative agriculture, things like that, that brings biodiversity back and doesn't further erode it. In the shared landscape, this is the classic place to have the idea of interconnected systems of protected areas. And then the large wild areas, it's really simple. We should be keeping them intact because we can't afford to run the world without them. And this is a really, really important thing. And the aggregate across all of this, it's possible to do half of the world. So drilling in a little bit. So this is a cities and farms landscape in Colombia coming into Bogota. These things are still important for biodiversity because they're very, very productive. Most endangered species tend to be there. But we have to allow nature to function in this landscape as well. I talked about the strategy. This is a paper that I was part of called Garibaldi et al., which suggests that in this area, we should set a natural vegetation target rather than a percentage protection target. So what if we had 20% native vegetation everywhere in even our city, most intensely used landscapes? That would allow for pollination. It would also allow for natural beauty. It would allow for a lot of species to survive. We could create ecological corridors with that. The city of Singapore is doing exactly this now. These ecological corridors, even up roads in the middle of the city, they're planting native species to try to draw, keep life around them. And we can do restoration, engage people in those kinds of settings, not just allow it to be completely devastated and bring nature back that way. This is sort of some of the ideas of how we could do this with this sort of diverse native flower strips and so on, offering habitat for pollinators and so on. I'll leave you to read that, but it's an interesting approach to these really intensely used landscapes. So the percentage target isn't even really that important in 18% of the world. This is, of course, the cedar of Lebanon. Actually, Emin was with me when I took this picture. Here we see ecological restoration going on. Yes, there's the beautiful old tree, but look at all the trees that have been planted here in Al Shuf Reserve in Lebanon. This is a very heavily impacted shared landscape, but it's coming back. It's probably in better shape today than it was 50 years ago. And so we can imagine bringing these things back, and we really need to. If you think about the interrelationship between the land and the sea, there's this problem called dead zones in the world's estuaries, and where the ocean, where fresh water runs into the ocean. And that's caused by things like nitrogen and phosphorus going into streams in the cities and farms, killing marine life, which is the best fishery in the world. And there's a really good example of managing pollutants like nutrients or human waste that comes from over here in your part of the world. This is Sharm el-Sheikh, where one of the most spectacular and most intact reefs in the world is in a national park. And it's still thriving right on the edge of Sharm el-Sheikh because there's tremendous nutrient waste management in Sharm el-Sheikh. So we can think this through and do good things, but there's some really great examples from your part of the world. In the shared landscape, that in-between part, protecting and restoring sort of is the vision. I mentioned this is in rainforest in Sumatra. This was cleared for palm oil illegally. This is a national park. This is recovery, actually, of trees that are growing back up to bring back the rainforest. So we need to protect what's behind there and bring back the stuff in the foreground. And this is where this interconnected system of protected areas, if we want things like tigers and grizzly bears and elephants and so on, needs to occur. I'm going to spend a moment on large wild areas. Emin mentioned you don't have wilderness. Not the same way we do, but you still have some pretty large wild areas. In the top right-hand corner here of the photo is the Amazon. Why these large wild areas really matter to the world. Some of them are full of species like the Amazon, the most biodiverse place in the world, forest, rainforest, it's the classic, everybody understands that the Amazon's important to the climate, it's important to the weather, it's important to biodiversity and to indigenous people, we all get that. But what we tend to know less of is this is the Amazon raining on itself. So about half the rain in the Amazon comes from the trees breathing out particles into the atmosphere and creating, releasing the moisture that then rains again on itself. Quite remarkable. And that biotic pump also is at risk if there's less than 80% forest cover in the Amazon. So it's actually doing something for itself. And if we lose that function, we risk losing this rainforest. And it's not just one species, it's the whole system flips into something else. In your part of the world, I think of how environmental change can be very serious. The farming environments, the Roman Empire depended on farms in North Africa. It doesn't anymore. Humans can cause big change. So this idea of these natural processes is really important because of this part of the Convention on Biodiversity vision of maintaining ecosystem services and sustaining a healthy planet. We can't just think about biodiversity and species, which is hugely important. All the pieces are needed to run the Earth machine, but also this other question of how the whole thing works together. So that process of rainfall in the Amazon, this globally important process, if we come to your part of the world, some of those processes are also occurring. So this is sand from the Sahara being blown into the ocean below England, which is carrying nutrients that causes plankton, phytoplankton blooms, which are part of the ecology of the Atlantic Ocean. And this is how the world works. It's not how we manage it. It's just how it is. And so obviously we want to maintain the environmental quality of those places if that's blowing into the ocean. And similarly, if we look here, this is in Chad. Remember I talked about the Amazon. In the Bodele Depression in Chad, which you can see on the right in this photograph, the dust from there blows into the Amazon and fertilizes the Amazon. 15% of the phosphorus in the Amazon, which is a phosphorus poor environment, which tends to, through rainfall, lose 15% of its phosphorus every year, is replenished by the winds from the Bodele Depression in Chad. So this whole Earth system is functioning together. We don't want something to toxify the phosphorus in the old lake bed of the Bodele Depression in Chad if we want to keep an Amazon rainforest. So we really need to think together about these large-scale goals. So how to tackle that is, there's been a bunch of models run. This is a paper by Koch et al., K-O-K here, comparing different kind of ways of thinking about how we live in the world. So strict protection from a species focus only, which is a species area curve strategy thing, which is sometimes called half Earth. Or shared Earth, which is, oh, no protected areas, just good, careful people everywhere. Or this three conditions approach were modeled by these, this is the Dutch Central Bank did this modeling. And they found the one that created the most benefits for people and nature was using this three conditions approach because it was a realistic approach to where we are as opposed to where we maybe ideally want to be in a perfect world. And then this is a paper about zoonotic disease risk in the Lancet, Planetary Health. We know this pandemic that has disrupted all of our lives, like all pandemics, has its origins in nature. This one that we've got now, we have this controversy about a lab in Wuhan, but really we know that all the preceding viruses, MERS and SARS and all those things, the bat viruses, if you will, all start with stressed bats in stressed ecosystems. If the bats aren't stressed, they're not shedding those viruses onto people. And an example is in university, a lot of people walk around with a herpes virus in their skin all the time. But during a stress period, they get cold sores, eruptions, and that's when they're infectious. This happens with animals in like bats. They get stressed, they release the virus, and then it spreads onto people and spreads around the world. If we want to prevent future pandemics, we need to treat nature better. So the scale of nature protection that we know is true is at least half the world. So protecting at least half the world can be done practically and fairly, or 30% can be done practically and fairly. But what we're suggesting with this Motion 101 conversation is, let's acknowledge what we need to do. Let's let the political system figure out what it can do. But if we don't know what we need to do, and we don't say clearly what we need to do at the IUCN's World Conservation Congress, which is the biggest conservation gathering every 4 years in the world, who else is going to say it? And how do we know what we need to drive towards if we're not clear about what we need to do? So those are my thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Harvey. That was very, very clear and very interesting. And I've been monitoring a little bit of the discussion on the chat and the Q&A. And one of the first question is, well, how do you do it when you have to start from scratch? And you have touched a little bit about some of that. I think perhaps what we may need to develop more is some guidance on how to do that conservation planning as to where are your priorities, what do you need, what criteria you may need to kind of consider as to what to start with, how do you go about that, and providing some guidance on how do we do some of that conservation planning. And the question came from Iraq, where in the Kurdish part of Iraq, actually, it's recognizing that not everyone is starting on the same from the same level, in that providing a little bit more guidance on that. So I'm not sure if you wanted to expand a little bit more.
Sure, I'm happy to talk about that. So I'm assuming that the question is coming from a place that's been heavily impacted by what we all know is some tragic events in Iraq. And how do you rebuild from there?
But we also have no protected areas, not many protected areas actually in that region at all. So kind of starting all of that.
So a really simple rule is the best nature is intact nature. Okay. Humans aren't as smart as the natural world or the creator in terms of making nature. So first, if I started from zero, I would say, where are the intact fragments, pieces of nature in your zone or country or region? Secure the intact nature first.
Right.
Now, securing that can be a range of tools. If there are people living there and so on, you can find the spectrum of protected areas or these other effective conservation measures. It's fair and just to do it. Secure doesn't mean march everybody off and put them in a prison while you save it. And Imen could tell you about all those approaches to protected areas. I don't have time now, but there's plenty of ways to do that. So secure the intact first, and then restore areas using native species. And I'm going to talk about that for a minute. And every, your cultures are so deep and so long in the Middle East. All your stories will be built around the things that grow naturally in your area. There will be stories about it. There will be food about it. There will be relationships with those things. And so how you get more of what is in your culture naturally is going to be better for nature. And you don't need somebody with a big textbook from some big fancy university in England or the East Coast of the United States to come and tell you what to do. Things that live there naturally belong there and can be brought back usually because they're used to living in those conditions if they're given a little bit of room and a little bit of, of protection. And so and then what tends to happen if you keep the intact pieces intact and grow them out, you'll see that then spread seeds and other animals can spread out. And it's amazing how the world will respond if you give it the native things that it has. And how all of us on this webinar are quite convinced about the power and importance of culture. Culture will allow people to see that this is part of restoring their own personal story and history. And you can't be who you are from a place without nature. Because it is literally who you are, what you eat, and is what is in your body. And so working with communities, people, even if you're dealing with people who aren't familiar with protected areas and computer programs and all this stuff, it doesn't matter. And we saw that at El Shuf. It was really interesting examples of, and Imen could share that Al Shuf Place in Lebanon has some good examples.
And then can I just jump in here? And just to highlight what Harvey said, in addition to protecting what's wild and intact and also restoring native species to areas, I think the third leg of starting from scratch is that education and outreach component, especially as it pertains to our identities, both nationally and as a culture. And certainly in the West, our protected areas are a big part of our national identities and who we are as a people. And using those types of educational and outreach programs that are both ecologically sound and also help build communities and strengthen national identity are key to building the support needed to carry this to the ambitious level we want.
Right. And kind of building on that, because sometimes when we are in these negotiations, and I have been in many of them lately in the Mediterranean, where in the marine side, we've set a regional strategy for marine protected areas and OECMs, and have been in long discussions about the targets and 30% and strict protection and I don't know what. When restoration is a big part of the solution, shouldn't that be a little bit more prominent in the title? Vance, Harvey, I don't know. This is getting, we don't want to open a contact group here, but the point on restoration, going back to native species and agriculture, is one that is very relevant for this region. And an example, you have very well cited the SHUF, which is having an entire program on biological agriculture and restoring these native species, both in trees and also on some herbs and so on. I mean, in Tunisia, I see a radical different approach where the agriculture is going for new variety of olives imported from Italy and Spain, while we have native olives that are more resistant to drought, and we're importing Italian and Spanish varieties because they sell better. We're obliged to give them water in a dry country and add to that climate change. So it may be more helpful to kind of, this is, yes, protected areas and we protect the impact, but there is quite a bit that is about changing our way of doing things and restoring that many.
So Iman, I'd love to speak to that. So this is the entire point of the three conditions approach. Don't worry that what you don't have, worry about what you have.
Yeah.
But be part of a global thing that's going to save the planet together.
Yeah.
This is basically the point. And we know that that's going to have to aggregate to us leaving about half the planet, primarily for nature to operate. That will include restoration. And indeed, in that condition one area, restoration is a primary strategy. However, if you get into the large wild areas, restoration is not your focus. Keeping it the way it is your focus. So you don't want to be interfering with that. There are traditional management systems and whatever's going on there. That's the value you're trying to preserve, not restore. And so so it's kind of a continuum of restoration. I did a crude graph once, which is in condition one, restoration is a primary strategy. And in condition three, it's basically an unimportant strategy at the extreme end of it. And then along the way, it varies. Right? Like if you even get to Yellowstone, they put wolves back 25 years ago. In Yellowstone, the world's oldest park, that's restoration. But it's put one piece back and then, oh, it works better. Right. But I think that this key thing is like your Tunisian example is a fantastic one of what I was trying to say. In condition one, why would you replace something that's inherent, that's from your place, that works in your place with something else? Answer, culture. And that's that question of sustainable production and sustainable consumption, as well as conservation, right? And that's why I mentioned those three things we need to do. Mm-hmm. Like, it is not better to buy a Spanish or Italian olive produced in one of those oliveries that's just devastated with olive trees, as opposed to one that's got a native olive tree you can harvest, that's got wildflowers and stuff at the foot of it. It's like, one is good and one is bad. Yeah. And what we're doing now is making more bad everywhere. and you can see it in southern Spain, the traditional olive groves and the industrial ones. The traditional ones are glorious in Spain, and the industrial ones are wastelands with olive trees sticking up. And we just have to change or not change.
Well, go back to the roots, right? Come back to the future. So I'll ask people to have a few more questions, but I wanted to, while I have more questions, one that is sticking in my mind is, how do you apply this in marine? Like how the three conditions are applicable in the marine environment? Or are we just talking about the terrestrial target, or tell me more.
Well, actually, it was a lot of thinking has gone into that. We haven't yet published a paper, but in the marine environment, the terrestrial environment, the number one threat to nature is converting habitats.
Right.
So in the marine environment, there's some of that conversion of habitats with bottom trawling and so on, but the primary threat in the marine environment is fishing.
Yeah.
So now in the areas of estuaries, like for example, in the Mediterranean, opposite wherever rivers and settlements are, basically the condition 1, cities and farms, extends into the water. And in fact, the condition of the marine world, as I mentioned in that image of Sharm el-Sheikh, is actually driven by what happens on land more than by what happens in the water, right? And the Sharm el-Sheikh reef is one of the most intact reefs in the world. It would be a large wild area condition 3 reef almost, because it's so wonderfully intact, because it's been very, very well managed. So now there's a lot of abuse of the Mediterranean fishery. We all know that. If you, having been visiting the Mediterranean for 50 years of my life, I've seen what's on the menu in restaurants change pretty dramatically in 50 years. That's gone downhill terribly. And there's a bunch of research just came out of Spain on this bottom trawling, disturbing sediments, and also releasing carbon now. So that we get back to this carbon nature interface in the water, just like land. In the Mediterranean basin, from a 3 conditions point of view, you're dealing with those physical threats to the thing from terrestrial inputs and marine actions. And then you're dealing with fishing. It's really straightforward. Now, if you get to Canada, we have all of that in the St. Lawrence River system, look just like there. But we also have the Arctic Ocean, which is unfortunately thawing now, but it's completely never been fished, except for by, traditional Inuit fishers. So you have this large wild ocean. So again, that's the sort of thinking about the potential for the application of this 3 conditions approaches. The really most important thing is, where are you? And what are the problems you face? And you can support a goal like protecting half the world without it being one that imposes an absurd challenge, like let's protect half the Mediterranean basin and allow no fishing and no people. Right. Not going to happen.
No.
Not going to happen. So don't talk about it. It's a ridiculous thing to talk about. But make the Mediterranean come back and be part of this grander effort that might include the Arctic Ocean not having ever any commercial fishing or any further exploitation. Sure, why not? That's sort of the idea.
And spatial planning, because I think spatial planning is going to be an important tool as to how do we, go in between the 3 conditions, particularly important in the marine. I'm looking at, I don't have many questions from the chat. I know that several need to go back to the negotiations of the CBD. So let me summarize this, and particularly because I am seeing in the list a few IUCN members, that it is important that this motion, in the discussion of this motions, that we articulate that this is what the science needs. We're not necessarily calling for this target to be adopted, but this is what the science needs, and we need a target that is close to that, but also that recognizes this is what we as human beings need to continue surviving on this planet. That it is a global target, that it's not going to happen on a country by country basis. This is a global target. And as you've seen from Harvey's presentation, that there is a way where we can rationally, practically, and pragmatically implement this. And I think, you know, for IUCN's members, for commission members, and a call to WCPA, as into some more guidance as to how do we do this in various contexts, because I think that's what's gonna lend it more in people's minds and enable more people to call for it. So I hope this was helpful to you. I don't know, Vance, Amy, Harvey, any few last thoughts, last words?
No, a privilege to be with you, and you're a wonderful part of the world. So
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, shukran, everyone. And I hope you'll be in Marseille. And if not, then please join the contact groups that will be online. Oh, we have one last things on COVID, on the impact of COVID. Maybe we can take it in by typing the answer, because we also need to run back to some of the negotiations.
yes, I have to get back to the other meeting. So shukran.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And hopefully we'll follow this discussion in Marseille. Goodbye.
We'll send a link to this presentation.
Perfect. Thank you, Vance.
Okay, thanks, Iman. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.